My boyfriend's mom called me a cringe high school dropout and said I'd spend my life folding clothes for people like her. When I tried to mention my mom's stroke, she rolled her eyes and said, "The saddest part is you probably can't even help his future kids with homework." I didn't say a word. That was 3 months ago. Last week, she sent me flowers and a card that just said, "Thank you for saving him." My boyfriend's mother mocked me for being a worthless dropout, but I was the only one who could save her husband's life. I dropped out of high school at 16 to become my mom's full-time caregiver after her massive stroke left her paralyzed and unable to speak. 3 years later, I was dating Chris and working at Target to pay for mom's medications when he finally convinced me to meet his wealthy family for dinner, though my stomach churned knowing exactly how people like them would see me once they heard the word dropout. His mother, Helen, opened the door wearing pearls and a frozen smile that faltered the second she saw my department store dress. "You must be Sarah," she said, stepping aside without offering a hug, while his father, Robert, assessed me from the living room like I was interviewing for a position I'd already failed to get. "So, tell us about yourself," Helen said once we sat down to dinner, though her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind. "Chris mentioned you work at Target." I nodded and explained I was a shift supervisor, but Robert cut me off mid-sentence. "And you're planning to go back to school, I assume? Community college, perhaps?" "Actually, I'm not sure yet about college because first I would need a GED and things are complicated with my mom's care," I started to explain, but Helen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Complicated? At your age? What could possibly be complicated about bettering yourself?" She turned to Chris with this pitying look. "Sweetheart, you know we support whoever you date, but shouldn't you be with someone who shares your ambition?" Chris tried to defend me, but his younger sister Chloe jumped in, home from Yale for the weekend. "Wait, you didn't even finish high school? Like you actually dropped out?" She said it like I'd admitted to kicking puppies. "I had to leave during junior year," I said quietly, but Robert was already shaking his head. "Had to? Nobody has to abandon their education. That's a choice, young lady, and choices have consequences." He gestured around their dining room. "This is what education and hard work build. What exactly are you building?" Helen touched her pearls like prayer beads. "I suppose some people just aren't meant for academic success. Someone has to stock the shelves." "Mom, please," Chris begged, but Chloe was already pulling out her phone. "Look, I found her Instagram. She posts these weird motivational quotes about strength and perseverance." Chloe read one aloud mockingly. "She literally posts about surviving each day like she's been through war or something. It's so cringe." Robert studied me over his wine glass. "You know what bothers me most? The entitlement. Your generation thinks you deserve participation trophies for basic existence. Dropping out isn't perseverance, it's giving up." "She probably got pregnant or something," Chloe whispered to her mom, but loud enough for me to hear. "That's usually why girls drop out, right?" Helen pretended to be scandalized, but her eyes lit up with interest. "Oh, Chloe, don't be crude. Though statistically speaking," she trailed off with this knowing look. I wanted to defend myself, but Chris already looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and die, and I didn't want to make this worse for him. "I volunteer with dropout prevention programs," Robert announced, "and every single dropout I've met has the same story. Bad decisions, no discipline, always someone else's fault." "Dating up, apparently," Chloe muttered, and Helen actually laughed. Chris slammed his water glass down, but his dad wasn't finished. "You want to know what I tell the kids in my program? I tell them about people like you, how you'll spend your whole life serving people like us, watching through the window at what you could have had if you'd just stayed in school. What must your parents think? Their daughter throwing away her future to fold clothes for minimum wage. What do they think about you latching onto my son? See it as your meal ticket?" I opened my mouth to mention my mom, but Helen cut me off. "The saddest part is you've dragged Chris down to your level. He used to date a lovely pre-med student. Now he's bringing home someone who probably can't even help his future children with homework." Robert stood up suddenly, his face flushed. "You know what? I don't want to hear excuses. The bottom line is that there is no good reason to drop out, and no one who's smarter because they didn't go to school. You're everything wrong with this generation." Then he grabbed his wine glass, but his hand trembled strangely, and the glass slipped, shattering on the floor. "Damn it," he slurred, but the word came out garbled. Chloe laughed and said, "Dad's hammered already," but I was already standing because I'd seen that facial droop 100 times in my nightmares, watched that same right-side weakness steal my mother's independence, and I knew we had exactly 180 minutes before the damage became permanent. "Call 911 immediately," I commanded, rushing to Robert. "He's having an ischemic stroke. Tell them we need TPA within the window." Helen scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. He's just had too much wine." I grabbed Robert's face gently, performing the fast assessment I'd done countless times. "Smile for me, Robert." Only the right side of his mouth moved. "Raise both arms." His left arm stayed limp. "What's your name?" Unintelligible sounds. The color drained from Helen's face as she watched the high school dropout she'd mocked for an hour demonstrate more medical knowledge than anyone in her educated family possessed, and I saw the exact moment she realized her husband's life depended entirely on the girl she'd just called worthless. I checked his pulse while Helen stood frozen, her pearls catching the light as she trembled. The rapid, irregular rhythm confirmed what I already knew. Time was everything now. Chris grabbed his phone and dialed 911 while I positioned Robert carefully on the floor, turning his head to the side. His breathing was labored but steady. I loosened his tie and collar, watching for any signs of deterioration. Helen finally moved, dropping to her knees beside her husband. Her hands fluttered uselessly over his chest. Chloe pressed herself against the wall, her face pale as she watched her father struggle to speak. The dispatcher's voice echoed from Chris's phone. He relayed the information I gave him, word for word. Ischemic stroke, left side weakness, speech impairment. Approximately 3 minutes since onset. I kept my fingers on Robert's pulse, monitoring for changes. His eyes tracked my movements, fear replacing the contempt that had filled them minutes earlier. I recognized that look. My mother had worn it for weeks after her stroke. Helen grabbed my arm. Her manicured nails dug into my skin. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. No words came. The woman who'd spent an hour mocking my education couldn't form a single sentence. Sirens wailed in the distance. I calculated the time. 7 minutes since symptom onset. We had 173 minutes left in the window for TPA administration. The hospital was 12 minutes away without traffic. Chris paced behind me, running his hands through his hair. He kept glancing between his father and me, his expression shifting from panic to something I couldn't quite read. The paramedics burst through the door. I rattled off Robert's symptoms, timeline, and vital signs. One of them nodded appreciatively at my assessment. They transferred Robert to the gurney with practiced efficiency. Helen climbed into the ambulance without looking at me. Chloe followed, still clutching her phone. Chris hesitated at the door, torn between following his family and staying with me. I made the decision for him. I grabbed my purse and headed for my car. He could ride with his family. I'd follow behind. The hospital waiting room would be awkward enough without forcing him to choose sides in the parking lot. The drive gave me time to process what had just happened. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel, not from the medical emergency. I'd handled dozens of those with my mother. The shaking came from the irony of it all. The man who'd called me worthless now depended on the knowledge I'd gained from the very situation that made me drop out. At the hospital, I found them in the emergency waiting area. Helen sat rigid in a plastic chair, staring at the admission doors. Chloe scrolled through her phone, but her hands trembled. Chris jumped up when he saw me. I sat across from them, maintaining distance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A television droned in the corner, playing some game show. The smell of disinfectant mixed with burnt coffee. A doctor emerged after 40 minutes. He confirmed my assessment. Ischemic stroke, caught early. They'd administered TPA within the window. Robert was responding well. The next 24 hours would be critical, but the early intervention had likely prevented permanent damage. Helen's shoulders sagged with relief. Chloe actually smiled. Chris reached for my hand, but I pretended not to notice. This wasn't the time. The doctor mentioned something about the person who recognized the symptoms and insisted on immediate treatment. He said their quick action had probably saved Robert from severe disability or death. Helen's jaw tightened. She knew exactly who he meant. We waited another hour before they allowed visitors. Helen and Chloe went first. Chris stayed with me in the waiting room. He kept trying to speak, but I focused on the television. I wasn't ready for whatever he wanted to say. When Helen returned, her face was blotchy from crying. She walked past me without acknowledgement. Chloe followed, avoiding eye contact. Chris went in next, leaving me alone with his mother and sister. The silence stretched between us. Helen clutched her purse like a shield. Chloe had finally put her phone away. I'm fascinated by how Sarah's brain works. She spots Robert's stroke symptoms instantly while his family thinks he's just drunk. How did she learn to recognize that facial droop and arm weakness so fast? I could have said something. Could have thrown their words back at them. Could have pointed out that the dropout they'd mocked had just saved Robert's life. But I didn't. My mother had taught me better than that, back when she could still speak. Chris returned looking exhausted. His father was stable, asking for Helen. She hurried back to his room, Chloe trailing behind. We were alone again. He started to speak, but I stood up. I needed to get home. My mother would be wondering where I was. Her evening medications were due soon. He offered to come with me, but I shook my head. I needed time to think. The drive home felt longer than usual. I stopped at the pharmacy to pick up Mom's prescriptions, using my Target employee discount. The cashier recognized me and asked about my mother. I gave the usual response. She was doing as well as could be expected. At home, I found Mom in her chair by the window. The caregiver I'd hired for the evening smiled when I walked in. Everything had gone smoothly. Mom had eaten well. No issues. After the caregiver left, I prepared Mom's medications. She watched me with knowing eyes. She'd always been perceptive, even more so since the stroke had taken her voice. I told her about the dinner, about Robert's stroke, about recognizing the symptoms because of her. She reached out with her good hand and touched my cheek. Her eyes filled with tears, not sad tears, proud ones. She understood what I didn't say, that every sleepless night, every missed class, every minimum wage hour had led to this moment. The knowledge I'd gained caring for her had saved a life tonight. My phone buzzed. Chris had sent a dozen messages. I turned it off. Tomorrow would bring its own complications. Helen would have to face me again. Robert would recover knowing he owed his life to someone he'd dismissed as worthless. The family dynamics would shift in ways none of us could predict. But tonight, I focused on my mother. I helped her prepare for bed, going through our familiar routine. The exercises to maintain her limited mobility. The medications carefully measured and administered. The gentle massage to prevent bed sores. As I tucked her in, she squeezed my hand 3 times. Our signal for I love you. I squeezed back 4 times. I love you too. In my own room, I finally let myself process the evening. The humiliation of their judgment. The satisfaction of proving them wrong. The complicated emotions of saving someone who'd shown me such contempt. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful for the knowledge born from hardship. Grateful that I'd been there at the right moment. Grateful that my mother's suffering had given me the tools to prevent another family's tragedy. My phone continued buzzing on the nightstand. I knew I'd have to face Chris and his family again. Helen's attitude wouldn't change overnight. She might even resent me more now, owing such a debt to someone she'd deemed beneath them. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I'd saved a life. Not despite being a dropout, but because of everything that had led me to drop out. The universe had a strange sense of humor sometimes. I thought about the pre-med student Chris used to date, the one Helen had mentioned so wistfully. I wondered if she would have recognized the symptoms, if she would have known about the golden hour for stroke treatment, if her textbook knowledge would have translated to real-world action. Maybe, maybe not, but I had been there. The worthless dropout had been the only one in that room full of educated people who knew what to do. There was something poetic about that, though I doubted Helen would appreciate the irony. The morning brought complications I hadn't anticipated. Chris appeared at my door before my shift, his face drawn with exhaustion. He explained that his mother had spent the night at the hospital, refusing to leave Robert's side. The doctors were optimistic about his recovery, but Helen had already begun rewriting history. According to her new version of events, she'd been the one who recognized the stroke symptoms first. She'd merely allowed me to help because I seemed so eager to prove myself useful. I watched Chris shift uncomfortably on my doorstep as he relayed this information. His loyalty to his family warred visibly with his knowledge of the truth. I didn't argue or defend myself. Instead, I focused on getting ready for work while he talked. My mother needed her morning routine, and I couldn't afford to be late. At Target, my coworkers noticed my distraction. I made errors at the register, miscounted inventory, and forgot to take my break. My manager pulled me aside to ask if everything was all right. I assured her it was, but my mind kept returning to Helen's revisionist narrative. The woman who'd frozen in panic while her husband's brain cells died was now claiming she'd orchestrated his rescue. 3 days passed before I heard from Chris again. He texted asking if we could meet for coffee after my shift. I agreed, though something in his tone made my stomach clench. We met at a small cafe cafe near the hospital where his father was still recovering. Chris looked terrible. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled. He explained that his mother had been telling everyone, including the medical staff, her version of events. She'd even convinced Chloe that her initial skepticism had been a test to see if I really knew what I was talking about. According to Helen, she'd suspected a stroke all along but wanted to verify my knowledge before trusting me with her husband's care. The absurdity of it might have been funny if Chris hadn't looked so conflicted. He knew the truth, had witnessed his mother's paralysis and my immediate response. But Helen was his mother, and family loyalty ran deep. He asked me to understand her position. She was traumatized, he explained. People process trauma differently. Maybe I could just let her have this narrative if it helped her cope. I stirred my coffee and considered his request. Part of me wanted to agree, to smooth things over and move forward. But I thought about my mother, about the dignity she maintained despite losing everything to her stroke. She'd never asked me to lie about her condition or pretend things were different than they were. Even without speech, she faced her reality with courage. I told Chris I understood his position but couldn't participate in his mother's fiction. He nodded, looking relieved and disappointed simultaneously. We parted with an awkward hug, and I sensed a shift in our relationship that I couldn't quite define. The following week, Helen's campaign escalated. She called my workplace, speaking to my manager about her concern for my well-being. She portrayed herself as a caring potential mother-in-law, worried about my lack of education and future prospects. She mentioned that she'd been researching GED programs and wondered if Target might be flexible with my schedule to accommodate classes. My manager, confused but trying to be helpful, asked me about these supposed educational plans. I had to explain that Helen and I had only met once, under circumstances that didn't involve discussing my education. My manager's expression grew skeptical. Why would this woman call about me if we barely knew each other? The conversation planted seeds of doubt about my reliability and honesty that I could see taking root. Chris texted apologies when I told him about the call. He tried to talk to his mother, but she insisted she was only trying to help. She couldn't understand why I was being so ungrateful for her interest in my future. After all, she pointed out, I'd helped save Robert's life. The least she could do was return the favor by helping me improve my circumstances. The twisted logic of it made my head spin. She'd found a way to minimize my actions while positioning herself as my benefactor. Every time someone mentioned that I'd saved Robert's life, Helen quickly added that she was now devoted to saving mine through education and guidance. 2 weeks after the stroke, Robert was released from the hospital. He'd recovered remarkably well, with only minor weakness on his left side and slightly slurred speech that the doctors said would improve with therapy. Helen organized a small welcome home gathering and, to my surprise, Chris insisted I attend. I arrived to find the house full of their friends and extended family. Helen greeted me with an effusive hug, loudly proclaiming to everyone within earshot that this was Sarah, the girl who'd helped during Robert's medical emergency. The careful phrasing wasn't lost on me. I'd been downgraded from saving his life to merely helping during an emergency. Throughout the party, Helen introduced me with variations of the same theme. I was Chris's girlfriend who worked retail but was planning to get her GED soon. I was the one who'd assisted when Robert fell ill. I was young and still finding my way, but with the right guidance, I might amount to something. Each introduction chipped away at my composure. I watched Chris across the room, hoping he'd intervene, but he seemed to be avoiding direct interaction with me. Chloe circulated with her phone, taking pictures and videos for social media. I overheard her telling someone that her mother had been so brave during the crisis, keeping everyone calm while managing the situation. Robert himself was seated in a comfortable chair, receiving visitors. When I finally worked my way over to him, his eyes met mine with an expression I couldn't read. He thanked me formally for my assistance during his medical event. The words were carefully chosen, clearly rehearsed. Helen hovered nearby, her hand on his shoulder, watching our interaction closely. I responded simply, wishing him continued recovery. As I turned to leave, he caught my wrist with his good hand. His grip was weak but insistent. He pulled me closer and whispered something that Helen couldn't hear. Sarah's silence speaks louder than Helen's revisionist history ever could. Turns out dignity doesn't need a diploma, and truth doesn't require a thank you card when you've literally saved someone's brain cells from becoming expensive confetti. The words were slurred but clear enough. I remember everything. Helen quickly intervened, suggesting Robert needed rest. She guided me away with a firm hand on my elbow, mentioning again how grateful they were for my help and how she hoped I'd take advantage of the educational opportunities she'd researched for me. The party continued for another hour. I found myself cornered by various family members who'd been briefed on my situation. They offered advice about returning to school, shared stories of their own educational journeys, and made subtle comments about the importance of ambition in relationships. The consensus seemed to be that Chris was a saint for standing by me despite my limitations. I finally escaped to the bathroom, needing a moment to compose myself. In the mirror, I saw what they saw, a teenage dropout in a department store dress, out of place among the educated and successful. But I also saw the person who'd recognized a stroke in seconds, who'd known exactly what to do while they'd all stood frozen. The disconnect between their perception and my reality was dizzying. When I emerged, Chris was waiting in the hallway. He apologized for his family's behavior, but in the same breath asked me to be patient. His mother was trying, he insisted. She'd researched GED programs, hadn't she? That showed she cared about my future. I wanted to ask why my future needed fixing, why my present wasn't enough, but his phone rang before I could speak. It was the hospital. One of the nurses wanted to speak with whoever had performed the initial stroke assessment. There was a discrepancy in the paperwork about who'd recognized the symptoms and called for specific treatment. Helen had listed herself as the first responder, but the paramedics report credited someone named Sarah. Chris's face went pale as he listened. He glanced at me, then away. I could see him wrestling with the choice between truth and family loyalty. He told the nurse he'd have his mother call back to clarify the confusion. When he hung up, he couldn't meet my eyes. I left the party without saying goodbye. The drive home was a blur of frustration and hurt. At every red light, I checked my phone, hoping for a message from Chris that would make things right. Instead, I found a text from Helen thanking me for coming and attaching links to 3 different GED programs in our area. At home, my mother was waiting by the window. The caregiver reported a good day with no issues. After she left, I sat with Mom and and told her about the party, about Helen's revisionist history, and Chris's complicity. She listened with her expressive eyes, occasionally squeezing my hand when my voice shook with emotion. When I finished, she pointed to her communication board with her good hand. Slowly, letter by letter, she spelled out a message. Truth always wins. I wanted to believe her, but Helen's version of events was spreading through their social circle like a virus. The more people heard it, the more real it became. My actual contribution was being erased, replaced by a narrative that maintained the social order they all found comfortable. The next few days brought more complications. Helen appeared at Target during my shift, accompanied by two women she introduced as education consultants. She'd hired them to assess my learning needs and create a personalized plan for my GED completion. She made this announcement loudly enough for my coworkers and several customers to hear. I tried to politely decline, explaining that I couldn't commit to classes while managing my mother's care. Helen's face transformed into a mask of concern. She hadn't realized my mother was still living. How wonderful that I cared for her. But surely there were programs, facilities, options that would allow me to pursue my education while ensuring my mother received proper care. The consultants nodded sympathetically, pulling out brochures for various social services. One mentioned that family caregivers often neglected their own futures out of misplaced guilt. The other suggested that my mother would want me to better myself, wouldn't she? They spoke as if my mother wasn't a person but an obstacle to be managed. My manager appeared, drawn by the commotion. Helen seized the opportunity to express her admiration for Target's flexibility with employee schedules. She hoped they'd support my educational journey. The consultants chimed in about tax incentives for businesses that supported employee development. My manager looked overwhelmed but made vague sounds of agreement. After they left, my coworkers bombarded me with questions. Who was that woman? Why was she so invested in my education? Was it true I was planning to leave? My manager pulled me aside again, asking if I'd been job hunting without giving notice. The seeds of chaos Helen had planted were already sprouting. That evening, Chris called. His mother was hurt by my rejection of her help. She'd spent considerable money on those consultants. The least I could do was meet with them once to discuss options. When I explained how her visit had disrupted my workplace, he suggested I was being overly sensitive. His mother meant well. She was trying to help. Why couldn't I see that? The conversation deteriorated from there. I pointed out that his mother's help felt more like sabotage. He accused me of being paranoid and ungrateful. I reminded him that I'd saved his father's life. He countered that his mother was trying to save mine. Round and round we went until I finally hung up in frustration. Over the next week, Helen's interference intensified. She called Adult Protective Services, expressing concern about my mother's care. She framed it as worry about both of us, suggesting I was overwhelmed and needed support. The social worker who visited was kind but thorough, inspecting our home and reviewing my mother's medical care. My mother and I passed the inspection easily. Her care was impeccable, the social worker noted. She commended me for the detailed medication logs, the physical therapy routine, the modifications I'd made to our home for accessibility. She saw no reason for concern and said as much in her report. But the visit itself sent ripples through my life. Neighbors saw the APS vehicle and drew their own conclusions. My mother's regular nurses asked questions about why we'd been reported. The caregiver I employed wondered if she was under investigation. I had to spend hours reassuring people and explaining the situation without bad-mouthing Helen directly. Chris and I barely spoke during this time. When we did text, our conversations were strained and formal. He mentioned that his father was progressing well in physical therapy. I responded with polite congratulations. He asked about my mother. I gave brief updates. The easy intimacy we'd once shared was gone, replaced by careful distance. Then Helen escalated again. She contacted my mother's doctors, introducing herself as family and expressing concern about the quality of care my mother was receiving. She suggested that a 19-year-old dropout couldn't possibly manage such complex medical needs. She wondered if they'd considered recommending professional placement. The doctors, bound by privacy laws, couldn't discuss my mother's care with Helen, but her calls raised flags in their system. At our next appointment, the neurologist asked careful questions about our support system and my ability to manage. I had to explain the situation, watching his expression shift from concern to understanding to anger on our behalf. He wrote a strongly worded letter to Helen, copying me, stating that my mother received exemplary care and that any further interference would be reported as harassment. He praised my knowledge and dedication, noting that many professional caregivers could learn from my approach. It was vindication, but it came at the cost of having to defend myself against accusations that should never have been made. The letter arrived at Helen's home on a Thursday. By Friday, Chris was at my door, angrier than I'd ever seen him. His mother was humiliated. How could I have involved doctors in our personal dispute? His father was upset, which was dangerous given his recent stroke. The whole family was in uproar. I stood in my doorway, listening to him rage about my selfishness and ingratitude. When he finally paused for breath, I asked a simple question. Did he believe his mother's version of events from the night of the stroke? The question stopped him cold. He stared at me, mouth opening and closing without sound. I watched him struggle between truth and loyalty, love and family. Finally, he said it didn't matter what had really happened. What mattered was moving forward peacefully. I told him that truth always mattered. My mother had taught me that, even without words. I couldn't be with someone who would rewrite reality for convenience. He left without another word, and I knew our relationship was over, even if neither of us had officially ended it. The next few weeks were a blur of small harassments. Helen left negative reviews for Target online, mentioning unnamed employees who were rude and unprofessional. She signed me up for dozens of educational programs, resulting in a flood of calls and emails. She sent GED prep books to my home, always with gift receipts showing how much she'd spent. Each action was perfectly legal and could be explained as helpful concern, but the cumulative effect was exhausting. I found myself checking over my shoulder at work, screening all unknown calls, dreading what new disruption each day would bring. My mother noticed my stress, her eyes following me with worry as I paced our small apartment. Then Robert called. His speech was clearer now, though still slightly slurred. He asked if we could meet privately. Despite my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a small park near the hospital where he still went for therapy. He looked older than before the stroke, but his eyes were sharp and aware. Robert, calling Sarah for a private meeting makes me wonder what he remembers from that night. Did he hear everything Helen said about Sarah while he was having the stroke? His clear eyes suggest he knows something important that could change everything here. He thanked me properly this time, acknowledging that I'd saved his life. He knew what Helen was doing, he said, and he was sorry, but he also wanted me to understand her position. She'd been terrified that night, faced with losing him. The fear had transformed into something else, something destructive. I listened without interrupting as he explained their family dynamics. Helen needed to be in control, needed to be the competent one. My quick action that night had shattered her self-image. She couldn't reconcile the reality of freezing in crisis with her perception of herself as capable and prepared. So she'd revised history to restore her equilibrium. He wasn't excusing her behavior, he insisted, but he was asking for mercy. He'd spoken to her about stopping the harassment. She'd agreed to back off if I would simply let her narrative stand. No more corrections, no more insisting on credit, just peaceful coexistence with different versions of truth. I thought about his proposal as I watched children play on nearby swings. It would be easier to agree, to let Helen have her fiction, but I kept thinking about my mother, about the dignity of facing reality even when it was harsh. I told Robert I couldn't promise to lie, but I wouldn't go out of my way to correct Helen's story either. It was the best I could offer. He accepted my compromise with visible relief. As we parted, he pressed an envelope into my hand. Inside was a check for $10,000. For your mother's care, he said, for what you did. I tried to refuse, but he insisted. It wasn't from Helen, he assured me. It was his personal thank you. I held that check for days without depositing it. It felt like blood money, payment for silence. But I thought about my mother's medications, about the specialized equipment that would make her life easier, about the respite care I could afford with that money. Pragmatism won. I deposited the check and said nothing to anyone about its source. Helen's harassment slowed after that, though it didn't stop entirely. She still sent the occasional educational pamphlet or left reviews that seemed pointed, but the calls to my workplace ceased, and no more social workers appeared at our door. It was a détente of sorts, fragile and uncomfortable. Chris and I officially ended things through text, a mundane conclusion to what had once felt special. He wished me well. I returned the sentiment. We didn't discuss his parents or the stroke or the lies that had accumulated between us. We just let it die quietly. Another casualty of that night's events. I threw myself into work and my mother's care. The money from Robert allowed us small luxuries, better food, a new wheelchair, a weekend caregiver so I could rest. My mother seemed happier, though she watched me with concern when she thought I wasn't looking. She knew I was hurting, but we couldn't discuss it easily with her limited communication. One evening, as I helped her prepare for bed, she spelled out a message on her board. You did right. 3 words that took her 20 minutes to create. I hugged her carefully, mindful of her fragility. She'd lost so much to her stroke, mobility, speech, independence, but she'd kept her integrity, her insistence on truth. I could do no less. Months passed. I heard through coworkers that Chris was dating someone new, a law student who met with Helen's approval. Robert continued to recover, regaining most of his function. Helen's version of the stroke story solidified into family lore, repeated at gatherings I no longer attended. But truth has a way of surfacing. One of the paramedics who'd responded that night happened to be shopping at Target. He recognized me and stopped to chat. He mentioned that my quick assessment had been textbook perfect, that we'd used it as a training example for new EMTs. He asked if I'd ever considered medical training myself. My manager overheard the conversation. Later, she asked about it, and I found myself telling her the whole story. Her expression shifted from skepticism to understanding to indignation on my behalf. She'd wondered about those strange calls from Helen, the sudden interest in my education. Now it all made sense. Word spread among my coworkers. They were angry for me, protective in a way I hadn't expected. When Helen appeared in the store again, this time alone, she found herself met with cold professionalism. No one was rude, but the warmth she'd once received as Chris's mother was gone. She left quickly, and I never saw her in my store again. The truth spread in other ways, too. The paramedic mentioned my actions to others in the medical community. The neurologist who'd written the letter defending my mother's care remembered my name. When Robert's stroke came up in conversation, medical professionals would sometimes mention the teenage caregiver who'd recognized it immediately. Helen's carefully constructed narrative began to crack. People who heard both versions noticed discrepancies. Some dismissed them, but others questioned. The more Helen insisted on her story, the more defensive she seemed. The truth eroded her fiction like water wearing away stone. I watched this unfold from a distance. I took no pleasure in her discomfort, but I felt validated. My mother had been right. Truth did win, just not always quickly or dramatically. Sometimes it won through slow accumulation, through whispered corrections and gradual recognition. My life settled into a new rhythm. Work, caregiving, quiet evenings with my mother. I started taking online courses, not because Helen had pushed me to, but because I discovered an interest in medical knowledge. My experience with strokes had opened a door I wanted to explore further. The courses were challenging, especially without a traditional educational background, but I'd learned to be disciplined through caregiving, to study symptoms and medications and therapies. The academic version felt almost easier than the real-world education I'd received. My mother cheered my progress in her quiet way. She'd point to my textbooks with her good hand, her eyes bright with pride. We developed a study routine where I'd read aloud to her, both of us learning together. It was peaceful and productive, a world away from the chaos Helen had tried to create. One day, almost a year after the stroke, I encountered Chloe at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable but approached me anyway. She'd graduated from Yale and was working at a prestigious firm downtown. She mentioned this quickly, as if establishing her credentials. Then, unexpectedly, she apologized. She'd been thinking about that night, about how they'd all treated me. She'd realized how wrong they'd been. She'd even told her mother so, though Helen refused to discuss it. Chloe wanted me to know that she knew the truth about who'd saved her father. I accepted her apology graciously. She seemed relieved, as if she'd been carrying guilt that my forgiveness could absolve. We parted cordially, and I realized I felt lighter too. Not vindicated exactly, but acknowledged. Someone from that family had finally said what needed saying. The encounter with Chloe marked a turning point. I stopped waiting for apologies or recognition from the others. I focused on my life, my mother, my future. The online courses led to a certificate program. The certificate led to job opportunities in medical administration. Slowly, I built a career that honored both my experience experience and my continuing education. My mother lived to see me get my first job at a medical clinic. She was there when I received my certificate, her eyes wet with tears she couldn't wipe away. I wiped them for her, and we celebrated quietly at home with her favorite meal and a cake I'd made myself. She passed away peacefully 2 years after Helen's harassment campaign. I was with her, holding her good hand, whispering that I loved her. She'd faced her stroke with dignity and grace, teaching me more than any classroom could about strength and perseverance. Her funeral was small but meaningful, attended by the caregivers and medical professionals who'd become our extended family. Chris sent flowers but didn't attend. Helen sent nothing. Robert sent a card with a handwritten note thanking me again for saving his life and expressing condolences for my loss. I appreciated his acknowledgement, even if it came privately. With my mother gone, I finally felt free to tell our story fully. I wrote about it online, in forums for caregivers and stroke survivors. I shared the medical knowledge I'd gained, the techniques that had helped my mother, the signs that had saved Robert. I didn't name names or seek revenge. I just told the truth. The response was overwhelming. Other caregivers shared similar experiences of being dismissed or diminished. Medical professionals reached out with encouragement and job opportunities. Young people who'd left school to care for family members found hope in my story. Helen never publicly acknowledged the truth about that night, but I heard from mutual acquaintances that she'd stopped telling her version of events. When Robert's stroke came up, she'd changed the subject. The fiction she'd worked so hard to maintain had become too heavy to carry. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd agreed to her narrative from the beginning, if I'd let her claim credit and accepted her patronizing help. Would Chris and I have survived? Would the harassment have been avoided? But I know my mother would have been disappointed in me for choosing ease over truth. The knowledge I gained caring for my mother saved Robert's life. That's a fact that no amount of revision can change. Helen can tell whatever story she needs to tell herself, but I know what happened that night. I know who froze and who acted. I know whose knowledge made the difference between recovery and permanent disability. More importantly, I know that dropping out of school to care for my mother was the right choice. Robert's trying to play peace broker while literally handing out hush money checks. Nothing says, "Sorry, my wife terrorized you," quite like 10 grand in an envelope at the park. It led me to knowledge that mattered, to connections with people who valued substance over credentials. It taught me that education comes in many forms and that wisdom isn't confined to classrooms. My story isn't unique. Across the country, young people make impossible choices between education and family, between their futures and their loved ones' presence. They're judged by people like Helen who see dropping out as failure rather than sacrifice. But those of us who've walked this path know better. We know that sometimes the most important lessons come from the hardest experiences. We know that caring for someone who's lost everything teaches you what really matters. We know that a GED earned while working full-time and managing complex medical care represents more determination than a degree earned with family support and financial security. I think about that dinner at Helen's house sometimes, how they'd mocked my Instagram posts about perseverance, dismissed my struggles as self-pity. They couldn't understand that each day of caregiving was a victory, that maintaining hope while watching your mother's frustration with her limitations was an act of courage. But I don't need their understanding anymore. I have my own life now, built on the foundation my mother and I created together. I work in healthcare administration, helping families navigate the system I learned through necessity. I advocate for young caregivers, connecting them with resources and support. And sometimes, when I'm training new staff on stroke recognition, I tell them about a night when a 19-year-old dropout saved a man's life because she'd learned the signs through personal tragedy. I don't mention names or family drama. I just emphasize that medical knowledge can come from unexpected sources and that we should never dismiss someone based on their credentials alone. The truth of that night lives on in these teachings, in the lives saved by people who learned to recognize strokes from my story. Helen's fiction might persist in her social circle, but the reality of what happened has rippled outward in ways she'll never know. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need defending or elaborate campaigns. It simply exists, waiting to be recognized by those who need it. And for every person who learned stroke symptoms because of my story, for every family that gets help in time because someone remembered what I shared, the truth wins again. My mother was right, as she usually was. Truth always wins. Sometimes it just takes longer than we'd like, but in the end, what really happened matters more than what people wish had happened. And what really happened is that a dropout saved a life because she'd learned from loss, acted from knowledge, and refused to let anyone rewrite her story. That's my truth, and no amount of pearls or prejudice can change it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Robert stood at my door, his recovery remarkable, but his left hand still trembling slightly. He'd driven himself against Helen's wishes, parking his Mercedes crookedly in our apartment complex lot. I let him in, watching him take in our modest living room where medical equipment mingled with everyday furniture. He sat carefully on our worn couch, studying the communication board propped against Mom's chair. His eyes lingered on the medication schedule I'd taped to the wall, the physical therapy charts, the detailed logs of her daily care. When he finally looked at me, his expression had shifted from curiosity to something deeper. He pulled out his checkbook and began writing. $20,000, he explained, sliding it across the coffee table. Not hush money, he insisted when I tried to refuse. Payment for services rendered. He'd researched what private stroke consultants charged for immediate intervention and assessment. This was fair market value for saving his life. I stared at the check, thinking about Mom's mounting medical bills, the specialized bed we couldn't afford, the experimental therapy program insurance wouldn't cover. Pride warred with practicality. Robert waited patiently while I wrestled with the decision, his good hand steady on his knee. Finally, I took the check. He nodded once, satisfied, then asked about Mom's care routine. I found myself explaining the daily challenges, the small victories, the constant vigilance required. He listened intently, asking informed questions that revealed he'd been researching stroke recovery extensively since his own. Before leaving, he mentioned that Helen had hired a private investigator. She wanted dirt on me, something to explain away my competence that night. The investigator had found nothing because there was nothing to find, just a 19-year-old dropout caring for her mother with exceptional dedication. That afternoon, I deposited Robert's check and paid off 3 months of medical debt. The relief felt physical, like setting down a weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten its burden. Mom noticed my lighter mood during her evening exercises, her good hand squeezing mine with extra warmth. 2 days later, chaos erupted at Target. Helen arrived with a lawyer, claiming I'd extorted money from Robert while he was mentally compromised from his stroke. My manager called me to the office where they waited, Helen's pearls catching the fluorescent lights as she outlined her accusations. The lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia, presented their case methodically. Robert's judgment was impaired. I'd taken advantage of his gratitude. The check was invalid, and they demanded its return. Helen sat beside her, radiating righteous indignation. I listened without interrupting, then calmly produced my phone. I'd recorded Robert's visit, a habit developed after Helen's previous false claims. His voice, clear despite the slight slur, explained the payment's purpose. His obvious mental competence destroyed their entire argument. Patricia's expression shifted from confidence to concern. She asked Helen about this recording, about Robert's apparent clarity. Helen's face flushed as she insisted her husband hadn't been thinking straight. The lawyer began distancing herself from the case, recognizing a losing battle. My manager, who'd heard enough, asked them to leave. She'd witnessed months of Helen's harassment and wasn't interested in enabling more. As they gathered their things, Helen's mask finally slipped completely. She hissed that I'd regret this, that she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. The threat might have scared me once. Now I simply returned to my register, serving customers while Helen's Mercedes peeled out of the parking lot. My coworkers, who'd overheard parts of the confrontation, formed a protective circle around me for the rest of my shift. That evening, Chris appeared at my apartment. His mother had called him hysterical, ranting about lawyers and recordings and my supposed manipulation. He wanted to hear my side, though his crossed arms suggested he'd already chosen whom to believe. I showed him the recording. Robert's voice filled our small living room, calm and deliberate as he explained the payment. Chris's expression crumbled as he recognized his father's sincerity. He sank onto our couch, head in his hands, finally facing the reality he'd avoided for months. He asked why I'd recorded the conversation. I explained about the false APS reports, the workplace disruptions, the medical professionals Helen had contacted. His mother had established a pattern that required documentation. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Did I still have feelings for him? The honest answer was complicated. I'd loved who I thought he was before he chose comfortable lies over difficult truths. That person seemed like a stranger now. I told him relationships required trust, and trust required truth. He'd shown me where his loyalties lay when he asked me to participate in his mother's fiction. We could never rebuild what his choices had destroyed. He left without argument, shoulders slumped with the weight of understanding. I watched from my window as he sat in his car for 20 minutes before finally driving away. Mom watched me with knowing eyes, recognizing the end of something that had ended long ago. The next morning, I woke to find our apartment door spray-painted with ugly words. The building's security camera had mysteriously malfunctioned overnight. Neighbors pretended not to see as I scrubbed the paint off, though Mrs. Cones from 2B quietly left cleaning supplies by my door. At work, I discovered my car tires slashed in the employee lot. The security guard, who'd been conveniently absent during the incident, shrugged apologetically. My manager reviewed the footage, but the cameras showed nothing useful. The vandal had known exactly where the blind spots were. I changed the tires using my emergency fund, grateful for Robert's check that made it possible. Each incident felt like escalation, Helen's campaign shifting from manipulation to outright aggression. But I'd survived worse. Every day, managing Mom's care had taught me resilience. A week later, I found Chloe waiting by my car after work. She looked different from the girl who'd mocked my Instagram posts, something harder in her expression. She'd been investigating her mother's behavior, she said. The private investigator Helen hired had revealed more than expected. Helen had contacted my high school, trying to find teachers who'd confirm I was a poor student. Instead, she'd learned about my stellar grades before dropping out, the advanced placement classes I'd been taking, the scholarship opportunities I'd abandoned. The truth had enraged her further. Chloe showed me emails between her mother and various contacts, all seeking dirt on me. Helen had reached out to former classmates, previous employers, even distant relatives she'd found through social media. The way Robert studied Sarah's apartment and all her care charts before writing that check tells me he really understood what she'd been through. I wonder if seeing those medication schedules and therapy logs made him realize how much knowledge she'd gained from real experience. Each attempt had failed, revealing only a pattern of responsibility and sacrifice. I asked why Chloe was sharing this. She explained that her father's stroke had changed her perspective. She'd watched him struggle with basic tasks, seen his frustration with limitations. It had humanized the statistics she'd studied at Yale, made real what had been abstract. She'd also spoken with the paramedics who'd responded that night. They'd been clear about who'd saved Robert's life. One had said my assessment was more accurate than many emergency room doctors managed. That had started her questioning everything. Before leaving, she warned that Helen was planning something bigger. She didn't know what, but her mother had been making mysterious calls and meeting with people Chloe didn't recognize. I should be careful. That night, I installed new locks and a security system I couldn't really afford. Mom watched anxiously as I checked windows and tested alarms. I tried to reassure her, but we both felt the walls closing in. The attack came 3 days later, but not how I'd expected. Helen had contacted Mom's disability insurance, claiming fraud. She suggested I was exaggerating Mom's condition to collect benefits while working full-time. An investigation was mandatory, they explained during their surprise visit. 2 investigators spent hours reviewing Mom's medical records, observing her limitations, questioning our routines. Mom endured it with dignity, though I saw the humiliation in her eyes as strangers assessed her helplessness. I answered their questions through gritted teeth, documenting everything. The investigation cleared us completely. Mom's condition was well documented, my caregiving beyond reproach, but the process had been invasive and exhausting. Worse, it had triggered a review of all our benefits, creating paperwork nightmares that consumed weeks. During this chaos, Robert called. He'd discovered Helen's latest actions and was appalled. He tried to intervene, but she'd become irrational, accusing him of taking my side over family. Their marriage was fracturing under the weight of her obsession. He offered to help however he could. I asked him to simply tell the truth if asked. He agreed immediately, promising to correct Helen's narrative whenever possible. It was a small victory, but significant. The insurance investigation had unexpected consequences. The investigators, impressed by my caregiving, recommended me for a respite care program. They'd never seen such detailed documentation or innovative adaptations for home care. Their report became part of Mom's permanent file. Helen's next move was crueler. She found the nursing home where Mom had briefly stayed during my hospitalization for appendicitis 2 years earlier. She convinced them to call APS with concerns about my ability to provide adequate care compared to their facility. Another investigation followed, more invasive than the first. This time, they interviewed neighbors, employers, anyone who might have observed our daily life. The scrutiny was exhausting, but every interview confirmed what the investigators already knew. Mom received exceptional care at home. Mrs. Cones proved especially vocal, describing how I'd helped her understand her own husband's medication after his heart attack. My manager testified about my reliability and dedication. Even the pharmacist who filled Mom's prescriptions praised my knowledge and attention to detail. The investigation not only cleared us, but resulted in a commendation. The lead investigator said she'd rarely seen such comprehensive care outside professional facilities. She asked if I'd considered teaching other family caregivers. Helen's campaign was backfiring spectacularly. Each attack revealed more evidence of my competence and her harassment. The paper trail she'd created through official channels was becoming evidence against her, rather than me. Then Chloe called with urgent news. She'd overheard her mother planning to have me arrested. Helen had convinced a friend to claim I'd stolen jewelry during a home health visit to their elderly mother. The friend owed Helen favors and had agreed to file false charges. I immediately contacted the elderly woman's actual home health agency, explaining the situation. They confirmed I'd never been assigned to their client and offered to provide documentation. I also filed a preemptive police report about the threat, creating an official record. When the false accusation came, I was prepared. The police found my documented timeline, the agency's records, and security footage from my actual location during the alleged theft. The accusation crumbled instantly, and the friend faced potential charges for filing a false report. Helen's friend quickly recanted, admitting Helen had pressured her. The police added this to their growing file on Helen's harassment. They suggested I consider a restraining order, but I knew that would only escalate things further. Robert moved out the following week. He couldn't tolerate Helen's behavior any longer, especially as it jeopardized his own recovery. The stress was affecting his health, his doctors warned. He needed a peaceful environment to continue healing. His leaving triggered Helen's complete breakdown. She appeared at Target during my shift, screaming accusations in front of customers. "I'd destroyed her family," she shrieked. "I'd turned everyone against her." Security removed her as she threatened increasingly wild revenge. My manager called the police while I stood frozen behind my register. Customers stared as Helen fought with security. Her perfect composure finally shattered completely. The woman who'd mocked me for lacking class was being dragged out like a common disturber. The police arrested Helen for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Chloe called hours later, mortified by her mother's public breakdown. Helen was being held for psychiatric evaluation, her behavior too erratic for simple release. That night, I found Robert waiting by my apartment. He apologized for everything his family had put me through. He'd started divorce proceedings, unable to reconcile the woman Helen had become with the person he'd married. The stroke had changed everything, but not how Helen claimed. He handed me an envelope containing documentation of Helen's harassment, the private investigator's reports, recordings of her planning false accusations, evidence of the vandalism she'd orchestrated. His lawyer had compiled everything for the restraining order I'd eventually need. I accepted the envelope, understanding its significance. Robert was choosing truth over family loyalty, a choice his son had never managed. He looked older, but somehow lighter, freed from the burden of enabling Helen's delusions. The psychiatric hold lasted 72 hours. During that time, Chloe discovered the extent of her mother's schemes. Helen had spent thousands on private investigators, lawyers, and bribes. She'd neglected her own health and responsibilities, consumed by the need to punish me. When Helen was released, she found herself alone. Robert had moved to a temporary apartment. Chloe was staying with friends. Even Helen's social circle had distanced themselves after her public breakdown. The perfect life she'd protected so fiercely had crumbled entirely. She made one final attempt at revenge. She contacted a gossip blogger who specialized in local drama, spinning a tale of a gold-digging dropout who'd destroyed a prominent family. But the blogger fact-checked the story and found the truth far more interesting. The resulting article focused on Helen's harassment campaign against the teenager who'd saved her husband's life. It detailed the false accusations, the vandalism, the systematic attempts to destroy someone who'd shown nothing but competence and grace. Helen's reputation, already damaged, was completely destroyed. I never spoke to the blogger, refusing to participate in public drama, but others did. The paramedics, the social workers who'd investigated me, even Patricia the lawyer who'd realized Helen's deception. The truth had too many witnesses to suppress. Robert's recovery continued to improve. He sent regular checks despite my protests, insisting they were medical consultation fees. He'd become an advocate for stroke awareness, sharing his story at hospitals and support groups. He always credited the teenage caregiver who'd recognized his symptoms. Chloe graduated from Yale and returned home to find her family transformed. She reached out occasionally, updating me on her mother's condition. Helen had entered intensive therapy, finally confronting the narcissistic collapse triggered by her helplessness that night. Chris never contacted me again. I heard through others that he'd moved to another city, distancing himself from the family drama. He'd chosen the easiest path, as always, running from the mess rather than addressing it. My life gradually stabilized. The harassment stopped, the investigation ceased, the vandalism ended. I could focus on Mom's care without constantly checking over my shoulder. The peace felt strange after months of chaos. Mom's condition remained unchanged but stable. Our routines continued, morning medications, afternoon exercises, evening massages, but now I performed them without the shadow of Helen's interference. We'd survived her campaign as we'd survived everything else, together. One evening, while preparing Mom's dinner, I realized I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. Not just relieved or vindicated, but actually content. We'd weathered the storm and emerged intact. Mom must have noticed my mood because she pointed to her communication board. Slowly, she spelled out, "Proud proud of you. 3 words that meant more than any apology or vindication could. She'd watched me face escalating harassment with dignity, never stooping to Helen's level despite provocation. I'd protected us both while maintaining my integrity. Helen's downfall reads like a masterclass in self-destruction. She spent thousands trying to destroy a teenager and ended up demolishing her own life instead. Talk about expensive karma coming with receipts and a psychiatric evaluation for good measure. The doorbell interrupted our moment. I found a delivery driver with an enormous flower arrangement. The card was from Robert. Thank you for saving my life and showing me the truth. Forever grateful. I set the flowers where Mom could see them, their bright colors warming our small apartment. They represented more than gratitude. They were acknowledgement, validation, proof that truth had finally won. That night, I updated our emergency contact information, removing Chris's name and adding Mrs. Cohn's. It was a small action, but significant. We were building a new support system based on genuine care rather than romantic illusions. Work improved dramatically without Helen's interference. My manager promoted me to assistant department head, recognizing the leadership I'd shown during the harassment. The raise wasn't huge, but it helped cover the security system and new locks. I started teaching informal caregiving workshops at the community center. Other young caregivers found me through word of mouth, seeking advice on managing medical needs while maintaining their own lives. I shared practical knowledge gained through experience, not textbooks. The workshops grew popular enough that the center offered me a small stipend. Between that and my promotion, our financial situation stabilized. I could afford better equipment for Mom, making both our lives easier. 6 months after Helen's breakdown, I encountered her at the grocery store. She looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes hanging loose, her pearls absent. She saw me and froze, uncertainty replacing her former arrogance. I could have walked past, but something made me stop. I asked how she was doing, keeping my tone neutral. She stammered something about therapy and medication, her eyes darting away from mine. The woman who'd tried to destroy me seemed broken herself. I told her I hoped she found peace. Her eyes widened at the unexpected kindness. She nodded quickly and hurried away, leaving her half-filled cart behind. It was the last time I ever saw her. Robert continued his monthly checks despite my success. He'd also started volunteering with stroke support groups, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of immediate recognition. He never mentioned Helen anymore. That chapter of his life firmly closed. Chloe sent a graduation announcement with a handwritten note. She was starting a non-profit focused on supporting family caregivers. My story had inspired her to use her privilege for something meaningful. She hoped we could collaborate someday. I pinned the announcement to our refrigerator, next to Mom's medication schedule and therapy charts. It felt like a full-circle moment, Chloe choosing service over judgment. People could change when faced with truth. The year anniversary of Robert's stroke arrived quietly. I spent it like any other day, caring for Mom, working my shift, teaching an evening workshop, but I noticed the date and remembered that night when everything changed. If Helen hadn't invited me to dinner, if Robert hadn't had his stroke, if I hadn't recognized the symptoms, so many lives would be different. The chains of consequence from that single evening still rippled outward, touching people I'd never meet. That evening, Mom and I watched the sunset from our small balcony. She couldn't speak, but her contentment radiated as we sat together. We'd built a good life despite limitations, found joy in small victories, created meaning from struggle. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my workshop students. Her grandmother had shown stroke symptoms, and she'd recognized them immediately. The hospital confirmed an ischemic stroke, caught within the golden hour. Another life saved by knowledge passed forward. I showed Mom the text. Her eyes filled with tears as she squeezed my hand. This was why we'd endured everything, not for revenge or vindication, but for moments like this. Every life saved justified every hardship faced. The next morning brought normalcy. Mom's medications, breakfast preparation, helping her dress. But I performed each task with renewed purpose. Helen had tried to make me feel worthless, but every action proved my worth. My manager asked me to train new employees on customer service. She said I had a gift for remaining calm under pressure, for treating difficult people with dignity. If only she knew how much practice I'd had. During lunch break, I checked my banking app. Between my raised salary, workshop stipends, and careful budgeting, I'd saved enough for the specialized therapy program. Mom could start next month, potentially regaining some hand function. The possibility of Mom writing again, even slowly, filled me with hope. She could express herself beyond our limited communication board. We could have conversations that didn't take 20 minutes per sentence. I submitted the therapy application that afternoon, using my break to complete paperwork. The administrator recognized my name from the caregiver workshops and expedited the process. Sometimes good reputation opened doors money couldn't. That evening, while doing Mom's exercises, I told her about the therapy program. Her face lit up with cautious optimism. We'd learned not to expect miracles, but even small improvements meant everything when starting from nothing. As I helped Mom prepare for bed, I reflected on the journey from that dinner to now. Helen's cruelty had unleashed a chain of events that ultimately strengthened us. Her harassment had revealed our support network. Her lies had highlighted truth's power. Mom settled into bed, and I performed our nightly ritual, checking monitors, adjusting pillows, ensuring water was within reach. Each action was an act of love, a refutation of Helen's contempt for caregiving. Before turning off the light, Mom pointed to the communication board one more time. Letter by letter, she spelled out, "No regrets." 2 words that captured everything. No regrets about dropping out, about sacrificing traditional education for her care. No regrets about standing up to Helen, about refusing comfortable lies. No regrets about the path we'd chosen together. I kissed her forehead and whispered goodnight. In my own room, I opened my laptop to prepare tomorrow's workshop. The topic was recognizing stroke symptoms, information that would ripple outward to save lives I'd never know about. Helen had called me worthless, uneducated, a dropout with no future. But here I was, teaching others, supporting my mother, building a meaningful life. Her words had lost all power, replaced by the truth of daily actions. My phone showed several messages from workshop participants, thanking me for previous sessions. Each message reinforced what Mom and I had always known. Worth isn't measured by degrees or wealth, but by impact on others' lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Mom's care was constant. Work demanded energy. Workshops required preparation. But I faced it all with confidence earned learned through surviving Helen's worst efforts. The truth had won, just as Mom predicted. Not through dramatic confrontation or public vindication, but through quiet persistence. Through daily proof that a dropout could possess more knowledge, compassion, and strength than those who dismissed her. I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, setting multiple alarms to ensure Mom's morning medications stayed on schedule. The same routine I'd followed for years, but now performed in peace, free from harassment and judgment. As sleep approached, I thought about the pre-med student Chris had dated before me. I wondered if she'd have recognized Robert's stroke, if she'd have acted as quickly. Academic knowledge mattered, but experience taught different lessons. My story would never make headlines or inspire movies. It was too quiet, too ordinary. Just a daughter caring for her mother, learning from necessity, refusing to accept others' limitations on her worth. But ordinary stories could still change lives. The last thought before sleep was gratitude. Gratitude for Mom's strength, for supportive neighbors, for work that provided purpose. Even gratitude for Helen's harassment, which had revealed how many people stood ready to defend truth. Tomorrow, I'd wake to continue the life Helen had tried to destroy. I'd care for Mom with expertise no classroom could teach. I'd serve customers with patience learned through harder trials. I'd teach others with knowledge earned through experience. And somewhere, someone would recognize stroke symptoms because of what I'd shared. Someone's loved one would receive treatment in time. Someone's family would avoid the devastation we'd faced. That was worth more than any degree or Helen's approval could ever be. The truth had won. Not in the way I'd once imagined, with apologies and acknowledgement, but in the quiet triumph of lives saved, knowledge shared, and dignity maintained despite everything. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Thanks for coming along as we explored all these questions today. It's always a treat to wonder about the weird and wonderful with you. Catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.